In the quiet, sunlit town of Brookside, where the church bells ring every Sunday and the community gathers in fellowship, there lies a story simmering beneath the surface. It's a story that will challenge the very foundations of tradition, a story that will unravel decades of beliefs that have gone unquestioned. This isn't just another Sunday service. Today, the doors of First Baptist Church will open to more than just its regular congregation. They'll open to a moment of reckoning, where one man's deeply rooted values will collide with the changing tides of the world outside. Picture this: a man, Henry, who has stood at the church doors for years, welcoming his community with a smile. A man who believes in the sanctity of his church, the purity of its traditions, and the importance of protecting what he has always known to be right. But today will be different. Today, Henry will be faced with a decision that will shake him to his core, forcing him to confront the very beliefs that have defined him for so long. This isn't just about one man, though. It's about a church, a community, a way of life that has resisted change for generations. But as the Jackson family, a black family, arrives at the church doors, seeking nothing more than to join in worship, the tension that has been quietly building will finally erupt. What happens next will not only alter the course of Henry's life, but could potentially shift the entire community's outlook on who belongs and who doesn't. The sun may shine brightly over Brookside, but shadows linger in the hearts of its people, shadows of prejudice, of fear, of the unknown. And as Henry stands at the threshold of the church, he's not just guarding the door, he's guarding the beliefs that have shaped his life. But what happens when those beliefs are challenged? When the very people he's been taught to see as other are the ones standing before him with nothing but kindness in their eyes? This isn't just another Sunday. It's the beginning of a journey that will force everyone involved to question what they've always known. It's a story of collision between past and present, between tradition and progress, between fear and understanding. And as the church doors swing open, so too do the doors to a deeper, more uncomfortable truth, one that will make you question everything you thought you knew about faith, about community, about who we choose to welcome and who we push away. So stay with us, because this isn't just a story about a church, it's a story about us all. And by the time it's over, you might just find that what happens inside those church doors has the power to change not just one man's heart, but an entire community's, and maybe even your own. Henry stood at the church doors, his posture straight and proud, as he surveyed the small parking lot that was gradually filling up with cars. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a crisp white shirt, a black tie neatly knotted at his collar, and a blazer that he wore like a badge of honor. Being the head usher at First Baptist was a position of great responsibility, and Henry took it very seriously. For him, it wasn't just about opening doors and handing out bulletins. It was about maintaining the sanctity of the church. He saw himself as the first line of defense, the gatekeeper of God's house, ensuring that only those who truly belonged were welcomed in. Henry had grown up in this town, in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and everyone looked the same. It was a place where values were passed down like family heirlooms. And one of those values was a deep, almost unspoken understanding of who belonged where. Henry's father had been a man of strict principles, and one of those principles was that certain people simply didn't belong in certain places. Henry had absorbed this belief as naturally as he had learned to tie his shoes. As the first cars began to pull in, Henry greeted the familiar faces with a warm smile and a nod. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. How's the knee?" he called out as one of the older ladies from the congregation hobbled up the steps. She gave him a smile, patting his arm as she passed by. The routine was comforting. It was predictable, like clockwork. But that morning, something different happened, something that caused a flicker of unease in Henry's chest. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a car pull into the lot, a car he didn't recognize. The vehicle was clean, well kept, but it wasn't the car that drew his attention. It was the people inside, a black family. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He watched as they parked the car and began to get out, straightening their Sunday clothes and preparing to make their way toward the church. There was a father, a mother, and two young children, a boy and a girl, all of them dressed neatly, as if they had gone out of their way to look their best for the occasion. But to Henry, it felt wrong. He quickly glanced around the lot, hoping, no, expecting, to see someone else, someone more familiar, to distract him from the discomfort that was now gnawing at his insides. But there was no one, just him, standing there, watching as this family, the Jacksons, they would later be known, made their way toward him. The unease twisted into something more potent, more visceral. His father's voice echoed in his mind, the old man's stern tone reminding him of what he had been taught all those years ago. We have to protect what's ours, Henry. Some folks don't belong in certain places. The words had been ingrained in him, a part of the foundation upon which his life was built. As the Jacksons drew closer, Henry felt the weight of his father's teachings settle heavily on his shoulders. He had a job to do, after all. The church wasn't just a building to him. It was a sacred space, a place where people like him, who shared the same values, the same beliefs, came to worship. And in Henry's mind, the Jacksons didn't fit into that picture. They were almost at the steps now, and Henry felt his palms begin to sweat. The father, a tall man with a kind face and a gentle smile, looked directly at Henry as he approached. "Good morning," the man said, his voice warm and polite, as he reached out to shake Henry's hand. Henry hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile as he took the man's hand, giving it a quick, firm shake before letting go. "Morning," he replied, his voice betraying none of the turmoil that was roiling inside him. The Jackson family began to ascend the steps, the children chattering excitedly about something, their mother gently shushing them. Henry's heart pounded as he stepped forward, positioning himself squarely in front of the doors, blocking their entry. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his tone deceptively polite, but there was an edge to it, a subtle undercurrent that he hoped the man would pick up on. The father stopped, his smile fading slightly as he looked at Henry, a hint of confusion in his eyes. "We're here for the service," he said, his tone still friendly, though a bit more cautious now. "This is First Baptist Church, right?" Henry nodded slowly, the wheels in his mind turning as he tried to think of something, anything, to justify what he was about to do. "Yes, it is," he said, "but, I'm afraid we're at full capacity today. Fire codes, you understand? It's a safety issue." The lie slipped out easily, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Henry's father had always told him that you had to be smart about these things, that sometimes you had to bend the truth a little to protect what was important. The man's brow furrowed in confusion, and he glanced behind Henry at the church, where a steady stream of parishioners was still making their way inside. "Full capacity?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "I see people going in right now." Henry felt his pulse quicken, a flush of heat rising to his face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice firm, as if that would somehow make his words more convincing. "But I'm going to have to ask you to leave." There was a moment of silence, a heavy pause that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The Jacksons stood there, the father's expression shifting from confusion to something more painful, while the mother reached out to place a hand on her husband's arm as if to steady him. The children, sensing the tension, fell silent, their bright eyes darting between their parents and Henry. Finally, the man nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly as he took his wife's hand. "All right," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a sadness that cut through Henry like a knife. "We'll go." And with that, the Jacksons turned and walked back down the steps, their footsteps heavy against the concrete. Henry watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, anger, all tangled together in a knot that he couldn't begin to unravel. He didn't know why, but as he watched them drive away, something inside him stirred, something that made him question, if only for a fleeting moment, whether he had done the right thing. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come, and Henry pushed the thought aside, turning back to the doors of the church, where the familiar faces of his congregation continued to file in, greeting him with smiles and nods, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed. In Henry's mind, he had done his duty, upheld the values he had been raised with, and protected the sanctity of the church. But deep down, a small, nagging voice whispered that something wasn't right. And though he tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, the voice remained, growing louder with each passing minute. As Henry stood by the church doors, still reeling from the confrontation with the Jacksons, he saw Pastor Williams approaching. The pastor was a tall, dignified man with graying hair that lent him an air of authority. His presence commanded respect, and his sermons were always delivered with a quiet intensity that left the congregation hanging on his every word. To Henry, Pastor Williams was more than just the leader of their church. He was a moral compass, the embodiment of the values Henry held dear. But as the pastor neared, Henry felt a pang of uncertainty. He had done what he thought was right, what he believed the pastor would want him to do. Yet there was that nagging voice in the back of his mind, the one that questioned whether turning the Jacksons away was truly justified. As Pastor Williams approached, Henry straightened his posture, bracing himself for what he expected to be a word of affirmation. "Good morning, Henry," Pastor Williams greeted, his voice even and calm, though there was a hint of something in his eyes, curiosity perhaps, or maybe concern. "I noticed there was some commotion here earlier." Henry nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "Yes, Pastor. There was a black family that came to the service. I told them we were at full capacity. It just didn't seem right, them being here." Pastor Williams raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp and penetrating. He looked past Henry toward the parking lot where the Jacksons' car had just pulled away, and then back at Henry. For a long moment, he said nothing, his silence stretching into a pregnant pause that made Henry's stomach twist with unease. Finally, the pastor spoke, his tone measured but carrying an unexpected edge. "Henry," he began, "this church is a house of worship, open to all who seek God's word. It's not our place to judge who belongs here." Henry blinked, taken aback. This wasn't what he had expected. "But, Pastor," he stammered, trying to find the right words, I thought you'd understand. We've always had a certain way of doing things here, a certain standard." Pastor Williams's expression remained inscrutable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or maybe just weariness. "Times are changing, Henry," he said quietly, "and we must change with them, or we risk losing our way." Henry's heart pounded in his chest. The pastor's words were like a bucket of cold water, shocking him into an uncomfortable realization. He had expected support, validation for his actions, but instead he was being challenged by the very man who had always reinforced the values Henry held dear. The pastor sighed softly, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "Invite them in next time, Henry," he said, his tone more gentle now, as if he were offering a lifeline. "We must show love to all who seek it. That is our duty above all else." With that, Pastor Williams turned and walked away, heading toward the pulpit to begin the service. Henry was left standing there, frozen in place, his mind a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. He had always believed that he was upholding the sanctity of the church, protecting it from those who didn't belong. But now he wasn't so sure. The service passed in a blur for Henry. He went through the motions, nodding and smiling at the familiar faces, handing out bulletins and directing latecomers to empty seats. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the pastor's words over and over again, like a broken record that wouldn't stop skipping. When the service finally ended and the congregation began to disperse, Henry found himself lingering by the door, his gaze distant. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him, like a dark cloud that refused to lift. For the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of guilt, real, undeniable guilt, that gnawed at his insides. As the last of the parishioners left, Henry stood alone in the empty church, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. He thought about his father, about the lessons he had been taught as a boy, about the rigid beliefs that had shaped him into the man he was today. His father had always been a stern man, quick to judge and slow to forgive, and Henry had followed in his footsteps, believing that this was the right way to live. But now he wasn't so sure. Pastor Williams's words had shaken him, had forced him to confront the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, there was another way, one that didn't involve shutting people out, but rather welcoming them in. Henry's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden buzzing of his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from Tom, his old friend who had been a constant presence in his life since childhood. Tom was a man of strong convictions, much like Henry's father, and he had always been quick to remind Henry of the importance of sticking to their shared beliefs. "Hey Henry, heard you had a little run-in at church today," the text read. "Don't let Pastor Williams get to you. You did the right thing. That's our church, and we've got to protect it from folks who don't belong." Henry stared at the message, his heart sinking. Tom's words were like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of the uncertainty that had been gnawing at him all morning. But at the same time, they were a reminder of everything that had kept Henry rooted in his old ways, ways that he was beginning to realize might be more harmful than he had ever considered. A part of him wanted to believe Tom, to cling to the certainty of the past, to reassure himself that he had done the right thing by turning the Jacksons away. But another part of him, the part that had been stirred by Pastor Williams's words, wasn't so sure. It was as if two voices were battling inside his head, each pulling him in a different direction, each demanding his loyalty. In the end, Henry found himself replying to Tom's message with a simple, "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it." But even as he sent the text, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted, that a door had been cracked open, a door that he wasn't sure he wanted to step through, but one that he couldn't ignore either. As Henry left the church and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, he felt a heaviness settle over him, a weight that he hadn't carried before. The day had begun like any other Sunday, but it had ended with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place, a sense that perhaps, for the first time, he was beginning to question the very beliefs that had defined him for so long. And as much as he tried to push those thoughts aside, to reassure himself that everything would go back to normal, he knew deep down that something had changed. The question now was whether he had the courage to face that change, or whether he would retreat back into the comfort of what he had always known. Only time would tell. Pastor Williams watched the congregation file out of the church, his eyes following Henry as he slowly made his way to the door. The pastor's face was calm, composed as always, but his mind was working through the events of the morning, replaying the moment when he had stepped in to address the situation with the Jacksons. He hadn't wanted to make a scene. Far from it. In fact, Pastor Williams had spent years honing his ability to diffuse situations without ever raising his voice or causing a stir. It was a skill he prided himself on, one that allowed him to maintain the delicate balance he believed was necessary to keep the church running smoothly. The truth was, he understood men like Henry all too well. In many ways, Henry was a product of the same environment that had shaped Pastor Williams himself. The pastor had grown up in a small, conservative town where tradition was revered and change was viewed with suspicion. He had been taught, just as Henry had, that certain boundaries were not meant to be crossed. But unlike Henry, Pastor Williams had learned how to navigate those boundaries with subtlety, how to speak in a way that conveyed one message to one group of people while signaling something entirely different to another. As he walked back to his office, Pastor Williams reflected on the path he had taken to get to this point. He had always been a man of the church, from his earliest days in Sunday school to his years at seminary. He believed deeply in the teachings of Christ, in the power of faith and community. But he also understood the world in which he lived, the world in which his church existed. And in that world, tradition was a powerful force, one that could not be easily dismissed. The pastor took his seat behind his desk, his hands clasped in front of him as he stared out the window. The sun was shining brightly outside, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawn of the church. But despite the peaceful scene, a tension lingered in the air, a tension that Pastor Williams knew was the result of the changing times. The world was different now, more complicated, more divided. The congregation was starting to reflect that change, and it was becoming harder to maintain the delicate balance that had kept the church stable for so long. Pastor Williams knew that men like Henry were important to the fabric of the church. They were the backbone of the community, loyal, dedicated, unwavering in their beliefs. But he also knew that Henry's way of thinking was increasingly out of step with the world outside their church's doors. The pastor was acutely aware of the tightrope he was walking, trying to uphold the church's traditions while also acknowledging that those traditions needed to evolve if the church was to survive. That was why Pastor Williams had intervened when he saw the Jackson family being turned away. It wasn't because he disagreed with Henry's instincts, at least not entirely. The pastor understood where Henry was coming from. After all, he had spent years teaching the importance of maintaining the church's values. But Pastor Williams also knew that times were changing, and with those changes came the need to present a more inclusive image to the outside world. It was a necessity, not just for the church's survival, but for its reputation in a society that was becoming increasingly intolerant of the kind of exclusion that had been a norm for so long. This duality in his approach was something that Pastor Williams had become adept at managing. To the congregation, he was a man of tradition, a leader who upheld the values they held dear. But to those who looked closer, it was clear that he was also a pragmatist, someone who understood the need for subtlety in maintaining those values while navigating the pressures of a modern, more diverse society. The pastor's sermons often reflected this balance. He spoke of love, acceptance, and community, but he did so in a way that allowed different people to hear what they wanted to hear. To the older members of the congregation, his words reaffirmed their belief in a close-knit, homogeneous community. To the younger, more progressive members, the same words suggested a willingness to embrace change, to move with the times. It was a fine line to walk, but Pastor Williams had become a master at it, using coded language to subtly perpetuate the church's traditional values while outwardly presenting an image of inclusivity. This balancing act extended beyond the pulpit and into the church's broader culture. The leadership of the church, of which Pastor Williams was a central figure, was composed of men and women who shared his views, people who believed in the importance of maintaining the church's traditions, while also recognizing the need to adapt, at least superficially, to the world around them. There were unspoken rules, understood by all, about how to handle situations like the one with the Jackson family. The goal was always to avoid outright conflict while ensuring that the church's core values remained intact. And this ultimately was why Pastor Williams had spoken to Henry the way he had. He needed Henry to understand that while the church's values were important, so too was the church's image. Inviting the Jacksons into the service was a way to avoid a scene, to maintain the appearance of inclusivity that the church needed to survive. But it was also a reminder to Henry that their way of life, their traditions, had to be protected, albeit more subtly than before. Pastor Williams leaned back in his chair, his thoughts turning to Henry's reaction. He knew that his words had unsettled Henry, had caused him to question his actions, his beliefs. But the pastor also knew that Henry was a man of habit, someone who had been molded by years of adherence to a particular set of values. It wouldn't take much to bring him back into the fold, to remind him of his role in the church, his duty to uphold its standards. The pastor's phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, a message from one of the church's elders, expressing concern about the incident with the Jackson family. Pastor Williams sighed, knowing that this was a conversation he would need to have, yet another instance where he would need to carefully navigate the waters between tradition and change. He sent a brief reply, assuring the elder that everything was under control and that they would discuss it further at the next leadership meeting. But even as he typed out the message, the pastor couldn't shake the feeling that the tension within the church was building, that the balance he had worked so hard to maintain was becoming more difficult with each passing day. As he put down the phone, Pastor Williams's thoughts returned to Henry. He would need to speak with him again to ensure that the older man understood the importance of following the church's unspoken rules, of maintaining the delicate balance that had kept their community together for so long. The pastor would offer reassurance, perhaps even a word of praise, to remind Henry that he was still valued, that his role as a gatekeeper was important, just as long as he did it with the subtlety that the times demanded. But as he thought about what he would say, Pastor Williams couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease within him. He had spent years walking this tightrope, balancing tradition with the demands of a changing world. But he knew deep down that there were limits to how long this balance could be maintained. Sooner or later, something would have to give. The pastor shook his head, pushing the thought aside. For now, he would continue as he always had, guiding his flock with a steady hand, using the language they needed to hear, and hoping that it would be enough to keep the church and its values intact for just a little while longer. But as he prepared to leave his office, locking up for the day, Pastor Williams knew that the challenges facing his church were only growing, and the next time he faced a situation like this, he might not be able to manage it with words alone. Henry sat in his favorite armchair, staring blankly at the television. The sound was on, but he wasn't really listening. His thoughts kept drifting back to the events of that morning, to the moment when he had stood at the church doors, blocking the Jackson family from entering. The pride he had felt in the moment had quickly been replaced by something else, something darker, more troubling. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, upholding the values his father had instilled in him. But now those beliefs were beginning to feel more like chains than guiding principles. The conversation with Pastor Williams had only deepened his confusion. The pastor had been clear about the need to adapt, to present a more inclusive image, but he hadn't outright condemned Henry's actions either. It was as if the pastor was trying to walk a line that Henry couldn't quite see, a line that left him feeling more lost than ever. As the night wore on, Henry found himself replaying the scene in his mind over and over again, each time feeling a little more uneasy. He had never questioned his actions before, but now doubt was beginning to creep in, like a slow, persistent leak that threatened to flood his entire sense of self. The nagging voice in the back of his mind had grown louder since he'd spoken to Pastor Williams, and it was getting harder to ignore. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with images from his childhood. His father's stern face, the sharp crack of his voice as he lectured Henry about the importance of keeping things in their proper place. "Some folks just don't belong, Henry. It's up to us to keep them out, to protect what's ours." The words echoed in his mind, twisting and warping until they became something he couldn't quite grasp, something that left him feeling both angry and afraid. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark and silent, but the echoes of his father's voice still lingered, as if they were etched into the very walls. Henry sat up, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream, but the unease clung to him, wrapping around his thoughts like a thick, suffocating fog. In the days that followed, Henry's unease only grew. He found himself withdrawing from the people around him, pulling back from conversations that once felt so natural. Even at church, he felt a distance between himself and the other members of the congregation. The smiles and nods that had always reassured him now felt hollow, as if they were nothing more than thin veneers covering up the cracks that were beginning to show. But while Henry struggled with his own feelings, the rest of the church community was buzzing with gossip. The incident with the Jacksons had not gone unnoticed, and it quickly became the talk of the town. Some members of the congregation supported Henry's actions, praising him for upholding the church's values and protecting its traditions. They whispered about how the church needed to stay true to its roots, how it was important to keep things as they had always been. Others, however, were less sure. Quietly in the corners of the fellowship hall or over coffee after the service, they began to question whether the church's values were really as unshakable as they had once thought. The world was changing, after all, and perhaps the church needed to change with it. These voices were softer, less certain, but they were there, growing in number as more people began to wonder whether something deeper was at play. For the Jacksons, the incident had been painful, but they had refused to let it keep them from attending church. They showed up every Sunday, dressed in their best, greeting Henry with a polite nod as they walked past him and took their seats. There was a quiet dignity in their presence, a grace that seemed to contrast sharply with the turmoil that was churning inside Henry. Every time he saw them, he felt a twist of guilt in his stomach, a reminder of the moment when he had stood in their way, trying to keep them out. But despite the Jacksons' resilience, Henry found himself sinking deeper into his own darkness. The more he thought about what had happened, the more he began to question whether he had truly done the right thing. The lines between right and wrong, which had once seemed so clear, were now blurred, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. It was during this time that Tom's influence began to creep back into Henry's life like a noxious fog. Tom was an old friend, someone Henry had known since childhood. They had grown up together, gone to the same schools, shared the same experiences. But while Henry had spent his life within the walls of the church, Tom had taken a different path, one that had led him further and further into the depths of resentment and hatred. Tom had always been outspoken about his views, never shying away from expressing his belief that certain people didn't belong in their town, much less their church. He had a way of justifying his beliefs, of twisting them into something that sounded almost reasonable, almost logical. And it was this talent that made him so dangerous, so insidious. When Tom heard about what had happened at the church, he wasted no time in reaching out to Henry. At first, it was just a phone call, Tom's voice on the other end of the line, full of admiration and encouragement. "You did the right thing, Henry," he said, his tone firm and confident. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty about it. That church is our sanctuary, and we've got to protect it." The words were like a balm to Henry's troubled soul. For a moment, they gave him the comfort he was desperately seeking, the reassurance that he hadn't lost his way. But as the days went on, Tom's presence in Henry's life began to grow, and with it, the toxic influence that had always lingered beneath the surface of their friendship. Tom started coming around more often, showing up at Henry's house with a six-pack of beer and a ready smile. They would sit on the porch, talking late into the night, their conversations drifting from the past to the present and back again. But no matter where the conversation started, it always seemed to end up in the same place. Tom's deep-seated belief that the world was changing for the worse, and that it was up to men like them to stop it. At first, Henry tried to push back, to hold on to the small sliver of doubt that had begun to take root in his mind. But Tom was persuasive, and Henry found it harder and harder to resist the pull of his old friend's words. The more they talked, the more Henry began to feel like he was slipping back into the man he had been before. Someone who didn't question, didn't doubt, someone who simply accepted the world as it was and did what needed to be done. And yet, even as Tom's influence grew stronger, there was still that small voice inside Henry, the one that had been planted by Pastor William's words and watered by the Jacksons' quiet resilience. It whispered to him in the dead of night, in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. It told him that things weren't as simple as they seemed, that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. But Tom's voice was louder, more insistent, and for now it was winning. As Henry sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt the weight of the day settle over him like a heavy blanket. The world was changing, and he was caught in the middle of it, pulled between the past and the future, between tradition and progress. And as much as he wanted to cling to the certainty of the past, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, something important that he didn't know how to hold on to. Henry knew that he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Sooner or later, he would have to make a choice. But for now, he was content to sit in the fading light, Tom's voice echoing in his ears, drowning out the small, persistent whisper that told him there was another way. Henry's days became a blur of routine and unease. He still stood at his post every Sunday, ushering in the congregation with a smile that felt increasingly strained. The once comforting rhythm of the church service, the hymns, the sermons, the familiar faces, now felt off-key, as if the whole world had shifted slightly, leaving him disoriented. The incident with the Jacksons had stirred something in him, something that he couldn't quite name but felt deeply nonetheless. It wasn't long before Henry started receiving unexpected messages, notes slipped into the collection plate, emails sent anonymously, and even a few phone calls. The first one came in the form of a handwritten letter, left in his mailbox at the church. The handwriting was neat, almost formal, and the words were carefully chosen. "Dear Henry," it began, I've been a member of this church for many years, and I've always appreciated the way you've welcomed us all, every Sunday without fail. But after what happened with the Jackson family, I feel compelled to write to you. I don't believe that what happened was right. I don't think it's what Jesus would want. I hope you'll take some time to think about it. We're all God's children, Henry. All of us. Henry read the letter twice, then a third time, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know who had written it. The note wasn't signed, but it struck a chord deep within him. The words lingered in his mind long after he had folded the letter and tucked it away in his pocket, the neat script looping through his thoughts as he went about his day. The next few days brought more of the same. Another note appeared, this time on his car windshield, urging him to look into his heart and ask himself whether he was truly living by the values he claimed to uphold. An email arrived from someone in the congregation, someone Henry didn't know well, politely suggesting that the church needed to reconsider its stance on inclusivity if it was to remain relevant in the modern world. Even a stranger who introduced themselves as a friend of a friend reached out via social media to say that they had heard about the incident and hoped that Henry would reflect on what had happened. These messages, though gently worded, began to pile up in Henry's mind, pressing on the growing doubt that had taken root after his conversation with Pastor Williams. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring to make him question everything he had ever believed. And the more he thought about it, the more those doubts began to gnaw at him, like termites eating away at the foundation of a house. But the most surprising, and perhaps the most unsettling encounter, came directly from the Jacksons themselves. One Sunday, after the service had ended and the congregation was milling about in the fellowship hall, Henry found himself face to face with Michael Jackson. The man stood before him, his expression calm, almost serene, as if he bore no ill will despite everything that had happened. "Mr. Jackson," Henry began, his voice faltering slightly. He wasn't sure what to say, how to bridge the gap between them that felt wider than ever. I hope you're doing well." Michael nodded, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Henry. We're doing all right. We're still here, after all." There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with a grace that made Henry feel both small and ashamed. He shifted uncomfortably, searching for the right words. But before he could find them, Michael continued. "Listen," Michael said, his tone gentle but firm. "I know what happened wasn't easy for you, and I know it's not easy to change the way we think, especially when those beliefs have been with us for a long time. But I want you to know that we don't hold anything against you. We believe that everyone has the capacity to grow, to learn. We're all just trying to do our best, aren't we?" Henry stared at Michael, his mind reeling. This was not the conversation he had expected. In his heart, he had feared confrontation, feared being called out for his actions in a way that would make him defensive, make him dig in his heels. But instead, here was Michael, offering him something that felt almost like forgiveness, something that left Henry feeling more conflicted than ever. I appreciate that," Henry stammered, his voice thick with emotion he didn't quite understand. "I really do." Michael smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made Henry's chest tighten. "We're all on a journey, Henry, and I believe that God has a plan for each of us, even if we don't always understand it. Maybe this is part of your journey, something that will help you see things a little differently." With that, Michael extended his hand, offering it in friendship. Henry hesitated for only a moment before taking it, feeling the strength and warmth of Michael's grip. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried with it a weight that Henry could feel deep in his bones. Afterward, Henry couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. The Jacksons' grace, their willingness to reach out to him despite everything, shook him to his core. It forced him to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Wrong in his beliefs, wrong in his actions, wrong in the way he had seen the world for so long. And yet, despite the growing doubt, there was still that part of him that resisted, that clung to the old ways of thinking, the ways that Tom had reinforced so effectively. It was as if Henry were standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that both terrified and intrigued him. He didn't know what lay at the bottom, didn't know if he could survive the fall, but the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crumble, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The church leadership, meanwhile, was scrambling to manage the growing unrest within the congregation. The incident with the Jacksons had sparked a wave of discussions, both within the church and in the wider community. People were talking, asking questions that hadn't been asked before, and the leadership knew that they couldn't ignore it any longer. In response, the church released a statement, a carefully worded, vague message that attempted to address the situation without actually saying much of anything. It spoke of the church's commitment to love and inclusivity, but also emphasized the importance of maintaining our traditions and values. It was a classic example of saying something without really saying anything, and while it might have satisfied some, it did little to resolve the underlying tensions that were simmering just below the surface. For Henry, the statement was just another reminder of the tightrope he was walking. On one hand, it reassured him that the church's leadership still valued the traditions he had been taught to uphold. On the other, it was a sign that the world was changing, that even the church was feeling the pressure to adapt, to present a more inclusive image, even if that image was only skin deep. The congregation was divided. Some praised the statement as a necessary reaffirmation of the church's values, while others criticized it as too vague, too wishy-washy to make any real difference. The Jacksons, for their part, continued to attend services, their presence a quiet, dignified reminder that the issue was far from resolved. As the weeks passed, Henry found himself increasingly torn between the old ways and the new. The messages he had received, the grace shown by the Jacksons, and the growing unrest within the church all weighed heavily on his mind. He knew that he couldn't continue to live in this state of limbo forever. Sooner or later, he would have to make a choice. But for now, he was content to let the questions swirl in his mind, to let the doubt gnaw at him, even as he clung to the remnants of the beliefs that had defined him for so long. It was a difficult place to be, but it was the only place he knew. And so, Henry continued to stand at the church doors every Sunday, greeting the congregation with a smile that felt a little less genuine each week, his mind a battleground of conflicting emotions. The world was changing, and Henry was caught in the middle of it, unsure of where he belonged or where he wanted to go. But one thing was certain, the ground beneath his feet was shifting, and it was only a matter of time before he would have to decide whether to hold on or let go. Henry sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the worn wood. He stared down at his hands, which were clasped tightly together, the knuckles white from the pressure. His mind was a tangle of thoughts, none of them clear, all of them pulling him in different directions. The unease that had taken root in him after the incident with the Jacksons had grown into something far more pervasive. It was no longer just a nagging doubt, it was a full-blown crisis of faith, one that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. Everything he had believed, everything he had been taught, was now under scrutiny, and Henry found himself questioning things he had never dared to question before. It was as if a dam had broken inside him, releasing a flood of emotions that he had kept bottled up for years. The anger, the guilt, the fear, they all came rushing out, overwhelming him, leaving him feeling lost and adrift in a sea of uncertainty. For the first time in his life, Henry was beginning to see the people he had always viewed as others, not as threats, but as human beings, people with their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it offered Henry a glimpse of a world where he wasn't bound by the rigid beliefs that had defined him for so long. On the other, it forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that he might have been wrong all these years. Wrong in the way he had treated others, wrong in the way he had seen the world. The weight of this realization was almost too much to bear. Henry found himself withdrawing even further from those around him, isolating himself as he grappled with his inner turmoil. The conversations he used to enjoy with his fellow church members now felt hollow, empty. Even his interactions with Tom, which had once provided him with a sense of camaraderie and reassurance, now left him feeling uneasy and conflicted. One Sunday, After the service had ended and the congregation was filing out, Henry lingered near the entrance, unsure of where to go or what to do. He felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see David, a young man in his early 20s who had recently started attending the church. David was known for his outspoken nature and his willingness to challenge the status quo, qualities that had made him both admired and, in some circles, feared. "Hey, Henry," David said with a friendly smile, though there was a seriousness in his eyes that didn't escape Henry's notice. "Mind if I have a word with you?" Henry hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but something in David's demeanor put him at ease. He nodded, and the two of them stepped outside, away from the bustle of the departing congregation. They found a quiet spot near the side of the church, where the noise of the street was muted and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. David leaned against the wall, crossing his arms as he looked at Henry with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with the Jacksons," David began, his voice calm but firm. "And I wanted to talk to you about it, because I think you're someone who cares deeply about this church and its values." Henry felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but he could sense that it wasn't going to be easy. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. David sighed, running a hand through his hair as he considered his words. I think a lot of us have been taught to see things a certain way," he said slowly. "We've been raised with these beliefs about who belongs where and what's right and wrong. But the world's changing, Henry, and I think it's important that we take a step back and really think about whether those beliefs still make sense." "Nay." Henry looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. "I don't know, David," he said quietly. "It's hard to change something you've believed in your whole life." "I get that," David replied, his voice filled with empathy. "But I also think that sometimes we need to challenge those beliefs if they're causing harm. The Jacksons, they're good people, Henry, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect and kindness as anyone else." Henry's heart ached as he listened to David's words. He wanted to argue, to defend the way things had always been, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he found himself nodding slowly, as if some part of him deep down knew that David was right, even if it was hard to admit. David leaned in slightly, his voice softening. "You know, Henry, I think a lot of the things we've been taught, things about race, about who belongs and who doesn't, they're based on fear. Fear of what's different, fear of losing what we have. But fear isn't a good enough reason to hold on to something if it's hurting others." Henry felt a lump form in his throat. The conversation was forcing him to confront feelings he had been trying to avoid, feelings that made him question not just his beliefs, but his entire identity. What if I don't know how to change?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David smiled gently, a look of understanding in his eyes. "It's okay to feel that way. Change is hard, but it starts with acknowledging that there's a problem and being willing to learn, to grow. You don't have to do it all at once, Henry. It's a journey, and it's okay to take it one step at a time." Henry nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had never thought of it as a journey before, but the idea made sense. Maybe he didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to just start asking the questions. The conversation with David lingered in Henry's mind long after it was over. It was as if a door had been opened, offering him a glimpse of a path he had never considered before. But just as he began to take tentative steps toward that path, the familiar figures of Pastor Williams and Tom loomed on the horizon, each pulling him back in their own way. Pastor Williams, with his calm authority and carefully chosen words, subtly reinforced the old beliefs that had kept Henry grounded for so long. He spoke of tradition, of the importance of maintaining the church's values in the face of a changing world. He reminded Henry that the church was a sanctuary, a place where the faithful could find solace and strength, and that it was their duty to protect it from outside influences. Henry found himself nodding along, feeling the familiar comfort of the pastor's words, even as the doubt in his heart continued to grow. Pastor Williams had a way of making things sound reasonable, of wrapping old prejudices in a cloak of righteousness that made them easier to accept. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that the pastor's words, while soothing, were only part of the picture. And then there was Tom. Tom, with his easy smile and his sharp wit, was always ready with a joke or a story that reinforced the way things had always been. He talked about the good old days, when everyone knew their place, and there was no confusion about what was right and wrong. He reminded Henry of the camaraderie they had shared growing up, the sense of belonging that came from being part of something bigger than themselves. But beneath the jokes and the stories, there was an edge to Tom's words, a bitterness that hinted at a deeper anger. Tom didn't just want to maintain the status quo, he wanted to fight against anything that threatened it. And the more he talked, the more Henry felt the pull of that anger, the temptation to retreat back into the safety of the past, where things were simpler, clearer. It was a struggle, one that left Henry feeling torn between the past and the future, between the comfort of old beliefs and the uncertainty of change. He wanted to move forward, to embrace the possibility of redemption that David had offered him. But the voices of Pastor Williams and Tom were strong, pulling him back to the familiar ground he had always known. In the end, Henry found himself standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. The conversation with David had opened his eyes to a new way of thinking, but the influence of Pastor Williams and Tom made it hard to let go of the old ways. The battle within him raged on, leaving him feeling more conflicted than ever. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Henry knew that he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Sooner or later, he would have to make a choice, to continue down the path he had always known, or to take a step into the unknown, toward a future that was both terrifying and full of possibility. For now, though, he would sit with his thoughts, letting them swirl around him like the evening breeze, unsure of where they would take him, but knowing that he couldn't ignore them any longer. The turning point was near, and Henry could feel it coming, like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break at any moment. Henry stood on the front steps of his house, the cool morning air brushing against his face as he watched the sun rise over the horizon. The sky was a canvas of soft pinks and oranges, the kind of dawn that promised a new beginning. But for Henry, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him, demanding that he make a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The days since his conversation with David had been some of the most difficult of his life. Every moment was consumed by the conflict raging inside him, a battle between the beliefs he had held for so long and the growing realization that those beliefs might be wrong. Pastor Williams's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the importance of tradition, of maintaining the church's values in a changing world. And then there was Tom, always there with a joke or a story, pulling Henry back to the comfort of the past, where things were simple and clear. But there was another voice now, one that had been growing louder with each passing day. It was the voice of doubt, of conscience, of a part of Henry that he had long ignored. It whispered to him in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, urging him to look deeper, to see the humanity in those he had once viewed as others.